welcome you to this session. And during this afternoon, we're going to be having a look at how we can access and build resilience during challenging times. And that clearly feels particularly resonant right now. And with how it's affecting us, this time of lockdown and COVID-19, how it's affecting us all personally and obviously at work as well. And so when lockdown began, or maybe beforehand, you will have moved into the phase of doing whatever needs to be done to survive. So shifting to home working, engaging virtually with teams and colleagues, and clients as well. And you may have activated disaster recovery plans at your work. So you were doing whatever it took to keep things moving, to protect your people and to look after your clients. And there's no doubt that for many of us, our resilience has been tested over the past weeks and months. And COVID-19 is likely to continue to impact us in the way we live, the way we work, and the way we lead for some time to come. And none of us really have any idea quite how that's going to manifest. So as we move into this next phase of reflection and planning for whatever comes next, our response to what's happening around us may test our resilience even more. And as a leader, that's something you may already be sensing in yourself, or you may be sensing in your teams or in the people around you. And the outcome of that is that in these unprecedented times, and they clearly are unprecedented, it seems the only word that we can find that kind of fits the bill at the moment. Because of that, they call for new and refreshed skills to come to the fore. So to that point, it's really important that we recognise that this art or this act of building resilience is a marathon. It's not a sprint. And it's about creating long-lasting changes that will support you through the unknown landscape ahead. So I invite you to settle in to the session today, to keep an open mind about what resonates for you, and about what actions you might choose to take away from the session. And just to note really that this is an interactive session in the sense that there are various activities that we're going to invite you to participate in. And as I said before, we'd love to hear your thoughts and observations through that chat function. So before we kick off, I just want to take a couple of minutes to introduce Kerry and myself. So Kerry spent over 20 years working in reinsurance industry. So she worked in broking, underwriting, and business development before taking her career break and then studying to do an MBA and retraining as a professional coach. Kerry's got her own coaching practice alongside Parity, and she works with leaders and managers and entrepreneurs, all really focused on helping people fulfill their potential. And her areas of coaching expertise include things like leadership development, emotional intelligence, role transition, and work-life balance. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Henny. I also have spent over 20 years working in insurance in various roles, including HR, marketing communications, consultancy, leadership development, and latterly as an internal coach at Aviva, the insurer. So I established Regroup, which is my coaching practice, a few years ago, and really to focus on the significance of self-care in creating deep and lasting change. And I specialise in one-to-one coaching, as well as running regular self-care and change retreats, and reflective retreats, really, looking at different facets and stages of change. So I specifically tend to work with people going through kind of key life stages. So that might be role transition. It might be things like work-life balance, but also things like returning to work and the menopause as well. So clearly, Kerry and I share a background in insurance and in the coaching work that we do. And that's part of the reason why we teamed up and created Parity earlier this year. But it's not the only reason. And so Kerry is just going to share a little bit more about that.
Hi. I'm sure you know there's a wealth of current research pointing to the fact that gender diversity progress in the insurance industry is really too slow, and more action needs to be taken to accelerate this change. So Henny and I joined together to form Parity because we recognise this gap. And we saw that we both wanted to use both our experience from the insurance industry, together with our expertise as coaches, to work with individuals and organisations to help drive some of this change that's required in the industry. And we know from personal experience how challenging leading can be in this industry. And we also know how valuable coaching can be for professional development. So in a nutshell, Parity's purpose is to work with current and emerging female leaders and their male colleagues to nurture that pipeline of amazing female talent in insurance and to create a more balanced future for the insurance industry. Okay, so our introductions are over. Before we start, could I ask you to take a minute and just think about what exactly you'd like to get out of the session today. And if you could just put your responses in the chat box on the screen, that would be great. I'm going to pause for a moment just to give you a few seconds to do that. Fantastic. And please do continue to put any further questions or comments in the chat as we go along. So I'm going to hand you back to Henny now, and she's going to start talking to you about the key traits and behaviours of resilience. And after that, I'll share a practical tool with you that can help think you through about what type of leader you want to be during this crisis. Okay, Hen, over to you.
Thanks, Kerry. So if we took a poll right now of how you're feeling on a scale of 1 to 10 of okayness, and then you answered the same question tonight and again tomorrow and again next week, you may well find that your answer differs each time. And that is completely normal. It's really normal for us to feel this kind of roller coaster of change. And even those of us who feel as though we're navigating our experience of COVID-19 on a day-to-day basis in an okay way, we may find that there is this little stream of anxiety running sort of underneath our kind of day-to-day experience, and that it may feel as though it's kind of ready to overflow its banks when something happens to activate it. So things that usually don't bother us do. And we may also find that things that usually do bother us don't. And I know I've experienced both of those kind of sensations myself. So just the simple act of noticing what we're feeling without judgment can be a powerful part of accessing and building our resilience. And even the act of noticing when we judge ourselves can be part of that. And this honouring of what we're experiencing and being honest with ourselves is a lovely quality for leaders to develop and to nurture. So by bringing this more empathic attitude to ourselves, we're better able to bring it into our relationships with others as well. And that can be a core strength, particularly, though clearly not exclusively, for female leaders. We are covering a wide range of resources today. And I just wanted to make a point that if there are things that you've heard before, that is wonderful. And it's a great opportunity to see what fresh insight it may bring. So what actually is resilience? Resilience helps us manage our emotional response to what's happening around us. And I think it may be useful to call out that it's a word or a state that's not always fully understood. So certainly I've heard it a lot in my corporate career, both as a leader and as a coach, and it's not always been in the most useful way or the most helpful way. So at times I've heard it used as a shorthand for put up and shut up. I've also heard it used essentially to say take on more stuff rather than let's deal with the stuff that's getting in the way. And there can sometimes be a kind of implicit sense of disappointment or an expectation of failure if someone else or us, ourselves, aren't deemed resilient enough. This word enough. At best, that's unhelpful. And at worst, it can be really damaging and can drive the wrong type of behaviours and lead to deep anxiety and stress. What we understand now through social psychology, through neuroscience, is that there are practical things we can all choose to adopt, and we'll be sharing some of these today, that will enable us to access and to build our resilience. And just as we've learned so many other things in our lives, we can learn this. So resilience is the thing that enables us to move forward without getting lost in things that may otherwise trip us up or trap us. And it's not a fixed attribute. It's a foundation stone to successful change, something many of us are experiencing clearly on a daily basis as we go through COVID-19. And at the heart of all of this is this sort of absolute truth that resilience is not about a stiff upper lip and burying our feelings, but rather it's about having love and compassion for ourselves that helps us remain strong even in the face of adversity. So we're going to be having a look at some findings from the American Psychological Association and the areas that they've identified that are core to resilience. So, quick reminder, any thoughts, any observations, anything you'd like me and Kerry to know or to sort of be aware of, then pop them into the chat and hopefully we'll have time to come to them during the session. So, making connections. When I first started sharing these ideas through the Work with Regroup, actually, around how we can build resilience, the use of social media used to be something I talk about not overdoing, and yet obviously now for so many of us it's become a lifeline, and it really makes me think that we're finally seeing its true purpose, you know, this how we can use it in a most beneficial way. The other sort of factor here though is that we also need to be mindful that we might end up a bit zoomed out. I'm not sure if that's something that you are experiencing or have experienced, especially if you're spending a lot of time in online meetings. So noticing how we connect with others is also really important. And as part of that, recognizing which relationships really nourish you can be a very useful process. So we talk sometimes of drains and radiators, you know, people who bring us energy and people who take it away. So connecting with other empathic, understanding people can remind you you're not alone when facing difficulties. What I'd really like you to do is the first of our little exercises or activities for the session is just to really quickly jot down the names of people who come to mind when you think of your most nourishing relationships. Maybe at work, maybe at home, maybe socially, wherever. So just write down whoever comes to mind. And even in a work context, where we can't always choose who we connect with, we can make choices about how we connect. So maybe sort of around the amount of time that we spend with the people who most nourish us. One thing here that the American Psychological Association talk about is this idea of investing in people who validate your feelings and create opportunities to connect with them. So it might be one-to-one, maybe in groups, like joining a group to provide support to others. That's a very resilient building activity. And even just being here today is a form of connection. So knowing that we're all here with a shared purpose of accessing and building our resilience is part of making connections. So I wanted to share a quick story of what resilience used to mean to me. For much of my career, I thought it meant the show must go on. And it led to me making some very interesting choices along the way, including one memorable time of trying to carry on working even when I was in an isolation suite in hospital after my third bout of pneumonia that year. And of course, I really wasn't well enough to work. And I had to learn to let go of that driver and prioritize my health over work, although it did take time to do that fully. And what we're experiencing today has really laid out that memory for me in stark relief. And I'm grateful, ultimately, that it taught me that critical importance that resilience without self-compassion serves no one. It doesn't serve you, it doesn't serve your team, it doesn't serve your organization, nor your shareholders, and it definitely doesn't serve your clients. So this quote from Mind calls out that inextricable link between resilience and well-being, and that's something that really sits at the heart of parity. And just as Brené Brown talks of vulnerability being our strength, Kristen Neff describes self-compassion as the opposite of self-criticism and self-loathing. And it's now being shown that developing our self-compassion really is core to building our resilience. And I can't emphasize that enough. So in a leadership context, compassion doesn't equate to weakness or letting people get away with things. These skills of nurturing and compassion, they're often seen as strong female traits. And it's really interesting to see how behaviours that we might have rejected in the past or not valued in the past are shown here to be really core to building greater resilience, both for an individual and for an organisation. And when we apply that to leadership and to organisational culture, we can see that celebrating and nurturing these traits brings even greater value. So as Mind says, looking after our bodies, practicing self-care and compassion are legitimate practices for mental health and building resilience. And modelling those practices is a sign of a great leader. So using tools like mindfulness, journaling, meditation, prayer, yoga, whatever it is that resonates with you, they're all foundational tools for helping us build our resilience, especially helping us access it, especially when we use that time to notice what in our life we are grateful for. So another invitation to you is just to really quickly, top of mind, list 3 things you're grateful for today. They might be big, they might be small, whatever they may be. So this practice of gratitude, it's where ancient traditions like Buddhist mindfulness and the modern science of positive psychology, it's where they blend beautifully. And going forward from today, it may be something that you choose to explore more for yourself. So maybe establishing a daily gratitude practice. Challenge yourself. Do it for 21 days. That's how long it takes to build a habit, and see what impact it has. So 2,500 years ago, give or take a year, Socrates came up with this pearl of wisdom. It's obvious this stuff is not new. Humans have faced into it for all of our generations. And the secret to it is understanding what we can control and what changes we can make to enable us to build on the new, as Socrates puts it. So in a moment, I'm going to share a tool that helps us keep sight of what we can control and what we can't, and look at how it helps us avoid the tendency to view crises as insurmountable challenges. And that's something, again, the ASA, the American Psychological Association, call out as key to resilience. So the other core things here in this area of finding purpose is it's about being proactive and taking decisive actions to help you face into challenges. So steps like breaking problems down into manageable pieces, taking that kind of initiative, it helps remind us that we can muster motivation and purpose even when things are stressful. And that then enables us to move towards realistic goals. So instead of focusing on things that may feel unachievable today, particularly in the context of what we're all experiencing right now, creating a plan of smaller goals gives us evidence that we can move forward. And obviously in times like this, that's incredibly useful. So another sort of facet of this idea of finding purpose is about looking for opportunities for self-discovery. Clearly we're all here, so that's part of that. But we also often talk about how challenge makes us stronger. So looking for opportunities to grow, to learn about ourselves and to make choices about how we want to be, that's a powerfully resilient mindset. Okay, so we're now going to take a moment just to look at some work that we are adapting from Stephen Covey's Circles of Influence. If you've come across the book 7 Habits of Highly Successful People, this is one of the things that he talks about here. So when Covey talks about these circles, he identifies them as, you know, this dark green one in the center is the circle of control. So in the context of where we are now, my circle of control may be, for example, like washing our hands. So I can control that I wash my hands. In the circle of influence that comes around the outside in the sort of, you know, mid-green color, I can get my family, I can talk to my family and get them to wash their hands. I can influence them to wash their hands. In the outer circle, in the circle of concern, I can't control whether or not other people wash their hands. So what Covey talks about is that we can break things down and see where our control, influence, and concerns sit. So it's an invitation to join us in another activity here, which is to draw 2 large circles on a piece of paper in front of you. And to think of a particularly challenging sort of situation that you have right now. So it may be COVID-19 and what's happening on a global scale. That might be what comes up for you. Or it may be something that is much closer to home, something that feels more specific to you. So it might be about a particular relationship, it might be about a project you're running, a meeting you have coming up, whatever that is. And in the first circle, to write down all the things that you can control about that particular situation. So I'll give you a few seconds to do that. And then as you're doing that and other thoughts start coming up, write down in the second circle the things that you can't control. So depending on the situation you're thinking of, things may shift from one circle to another. So for example, if you're concerned about an upcoming meeting with a colleague and you have a sense that it may be a challenging conversation or a challenging meeting, sometimes you can control the environment where you have the meeting to make things more conducive to good communication. But these days, that may not be possible because you can't necessarily control the Zoom environment that your colleague is in, what's going on in their home life, where they're at. But you can always control how you show up into the meeting. So, you can sort of control how you prepare for the meeting and that kind of thing. And that thing about how we show up comes up beautifully in the work by Amy Cuddy. There's a fantastic TED talk that she did quite a few years ago now, but really recommended if you haven't seen it, and we'll include a link to that actually in the follow-up notes. So as you continue to look at your circles, you may also find that fresh ideas start springing out and from what you've written. And just a sort of another note here, really, you can use this as a really simple model, really simple tool to keep coming back to it every time you face something that feels particularly challenging. And the invitation is just to see what insight it gives you about where you want to focus your energy, how you want to choose your goals, what actions you can take, etc. So this next one, think well. Part of thinking well is accepting that change is a natural and unavoidable part of life. We are hardwired to resist change as we naturally turn from the unknown because that's scary. And yet change is such a fundamental part of the human condition. If you think about evolution, we wouldn't be here unless we changed. So the only thing we can ever actually rely on is that things will change. That's the only constant. There's that quote, isn't there, about yes, about change, which is now just flung out of my head. So accepting this and embracing it, even, it helps us shape a growth mindset that makes us more adaptive and calmer in the face of change. And it's a choice. It's a choice that we're all able to make. And it's one of the things that Kerry's going to come and talk about later. However, change can be scary. And right now, for many of us, this is a place of fear. And this phrase, fear is like Velcro. For me, it just absolutely illustrates how fear kind of attracts and attaches itself to all the other fears that we have, whether it's about our personal circumstances, whether it's about things happening at work, or things outside in the wider world. If you find yourself in this fear-based mindset, one approach is to list the things that your brain is telling you to be afraid of, and then to review that list and check in with yourself on how real the fear is. What evidence do you have? What single action can you take to move towards better? And it helps kind of unstick that Velcro-like quality. And it helps us maintain a positive view of ourselves and our abilities. And it keeps us hopeful, which again is something that the ASA see as being core to resilience. And just as having a hopeful outlook on the future really helps us, we can also look back at things that we've learned from the past. That's another very valuable tool. So coming on to this last one around seeking support, it can't be emphasized enough. None of us are islands. And the sketch from Charlie, well, it really says it all. So as a last invitation for this part of accessing resilience, I'd like to invite you to take a moment, think through these 5 areas that I've described today, grab your pen and note down what one action do you choose today that will support you in accessing your resilience. I'll give you a few seconds there. So this may be something you're going to do, maybe a conversation you're going to have. It may be reaching out to somebody. It may be a way of thinking about how you're going to change the way you're thinking. You may have more than one action that comes to mind. Note those down too. Okay. I'm going to hand over to Kerry now, who is going to illustrate how some of these traits come to life when we look at the benefits of having a growth mindset as a leader during COVID-19. Over to you, Kerry.
Thanks, Henny. I've certainly noticed my personal resilience ebb and flow a bit during this crisis, and I'm personally finding the Zoom social connections and a bit of self-compassion is pretty helpful right now, and not beating myself up if I don't get to the end of my daily to-do list. So Henny has described the key traits and behaviours identified as being core to resilience. And I would now like to talk a little bit about a practical tool that can be used to think about when you're building resilience and as a leader in developing this growth mindset during the current crisis. I really like the simplicity of this tool and how it takes you through 3 distinct phases, from fear to learning to growth. And it's useful as we check in with ourselves on where we're at any given time. You know, remembering that our resilience ebbs and flows or sometimes I like to think of it like a little bit of a pendulum, from sort of coping to thriving, depending what's kind of going on. I'm going to take a few minutes to guide you through each of these zones, and then we'll share the slides at the end of the webinar so you can take some time to reflect on these further. So the first zone we're going to tackle is the fear zone, and you're absolutely, totally justified to feel fearful during this current crisis. And for me, sometimes I can feel fearful just after I've listened to some disturbing COVID-related news. And when we're in this zone, you often feel physically uncomfortable. You may feel your heart racing, you may feel some shallow breathing, and you might even find it difficult to concentrate and even sleep. And this is when our limbic system kicks in, and your body releases cortisol and other stress-related hormones, and it's when the emotional part of the brain takes over. This is our natural response to fear, and our bodies are preparing for this flight, fight, or freeze reaction, and this is an ancient survival mechanism designed to protect us. However, when the amygdala in the brain takes over, it interferes with our ability to think logically and rationally, and crucially, it interferes with our judgment and also self-control and reasoning. So being in the fear zone really, interferes with our performance as a leader, and ultimately, over a long term, can interfere with our health and well-being. So ideally, we really don't want to spend too much time in this zone, and then we really don't want our colleagues to spend too much time here either. So moving on to the second zone, the learning zone, Henny mentioned earlier about accepting what we can and what we can't control, and we went through the circles exercise together. And it's really important to think more about what we can control and influence, because this helps us to move forward and gets us out of that fear zone. So if we take one of the examples here, just to share with you, I've certainly limited the amount of news that I consume as this pandemic has developed, and because it interferes with my ability to concentrate and remain focused and motivated, throughout the day. And I've noticed news can be a bit like a drug. It has an addictive quality. And for those Harry Potter fans out there, for me, it's a bit like the Dementors. It can really draw positive energy and motivation out of us. And we know as a leader, it's really important to remain positive and hopeful and role model the desirable behaviours to the people around us, especially during a crisis like this. So picking up from what Henny said earlier, nurturing resilience is also about self-compassion and being kind to yourself. So if you've had a bad day, if you've overindulged, then I personally find it's important to regularly reflect, to maintain some balance, and to have some sort of routine. So if I've overindulged in a bit of news, I've thought and reflected and just thought about what impact that has had on my working day, on my home day, and think about what I'm going to do differently tomorrow, and be kind to yourself and gently move on. And for some of us, no news really is good news, and for others it might just be helpful to limit the amount of time we expose ourselves to news during the day. And this approach could equally apply to the overconsumption of food, of alcohol, or even shopping. Research shows that if we identify our emotions, it can be really powerful. And as leaders, it's really important to make space for our emotions. If we bottle emotions up and don't express them, it can be very damaging for our long-term mental health and well-being. In fact, you may be familiar with a famous Harvard psychologist called Susan David, and she's been posting on LinkedIn about how important it is to allow our children to express their emotions. So evidence shows us it's useful to label and to feel and to measure. And if I could just give you an example, if I'm feeling particularly overwhelmed or a little off balance, I go through this process of checking in on myself, and I'll say, what exact emotion am I feeling right now? And I might say, I'm feeling a bit anxious. And once you've labelled the emotion, the next step is to measure it. So I might say, well, at the moment I'm feeling anxious on a scale of around sort of 7 out of 10. And then the next step is to take some deliberate action. When I get anxious, personally, I find things like rational planning, deep breathing, mindfulness, walking with my dogs, physical exercise, yoga, or even having some fun can have a really positive effect and help me rebalance and reduce that anxiety. The next part of the process is, having taken that action, you check in again and you feel that emotion. And in this particular example, my anxiety may have moved down from a 7 to a 4, having gone through this process. One other thing you can do to help reduce any anxiety or to explore your emotions is to talk about them. And I find talking about emotions with a colleague, a coach, my husband, or a good friend can be very beneficial too. So Moving on to one of the other examples, the evidence suggests that as female leaders, we are naturally more empathetic, collaborative, and we tend to have a more relational style of leadership. And you'll see some of this being highlighted by some of the very effective global leaders around the world during the crisis. So empathising with colleagues and clients, being flexible with working hours, or acknowledging that we're all trying to do our best is key to organisational morale and performance. And also, we know from evidence from positive psychology that people who leverage their strengths, and in this example, natural empathy, a collaborative approach, or your relational style, they report better levels of self-efficacy, so self-belief in your own success, and better well-being over time. Finally, moving into the growth zone, if we choose one of the examples here, this whole zone relates to where leaders and people really are performing at their best, and it's where stress hormones are at their lowest, and it's where our psychological and emotional well-being is maximised. So starting at the top, in this example, having a purpose, which is what Henny mentioned also earlier, having a purpose during the crisis and serving others, your colleagues and your clients, and seeing how you can help them is not only good for your well-being, but it's also good for your team, their performance, and also for your organisation. And Henny also talked about making connections as a key trait or behaviour core to resilience. And as leaders, we need to be consistently connecting with colleagues and clients to ensure they're heard. And also this in turn reduces their anxiety and creates stability. And practicing the skills of deep listening can also dramatically improve the quality of that connection. And again, it's a way of modelling behaviours you wish to see within your teams. And finally, transparency is also shown to be really important. The more information you're able to share with others, the more credible and trustworthy you'll be as a leader. And this in turn helps to reduce anxiety and make people feel safe. Moving on to the next example. Greater collaboration, innovation, creativity, and a relational style are all talents typically women bring to their organisations. And these talents are especially valuable now as the insurance industry responds to COVID-19, a significant market loss, and a deep recession. We also know from neuroscience that reframing a problem can switch off the amygdala, we talked about earlier, within the brain, and this allows us to think more rationally and creatively and to come up with innovative solutions to a problem. So with this reframing process in mind, and thinking about the current situation, it might be useful just to ask yourself the following questions. Number one, are your current products and services best serving your clients right now? And what do your clients really need from you during this crisis? What do your colleagues need? And what do you need to do more of? What needs to change? And what does your organisation need to do to adapt, to survive, to thrive? I know this has been a lot of information to digest, but I hope the whistle stop tour we've just given you gives you a flavour of how you can use this tool. And there's plenty more rich reflection that can be done either here on your own, with colleagues, or with a coach. And this is really a very effective tool that can help to reduce fear and enable learning and growth and build resilience as individuals, as leaders within your teams and across the organisation. Finally, just before we wrap up, I'm going to ask you to grab a pen and a piece of paper once again and just take a minute to write a response down to the following question. If you look at those strategies in the learning and the growth zone we've just briefly been through, just choose one of them and think about one thing you could change that would, or do differently, that you would like to do that would make a big impact for you as a resilient leader during this crisis. And I'll give you a minute to give you time to think, reflect and write something down. Okay, if you'd like to work through this tool in more detail or learn more how to maximise the benefits of what we've explored today, either on a one-to-one basis or in small groups, then please do get in touch. Back over to you, Henny.
Thank you, Kerry. I really love how that model shows how we can shift from fear into a place of learning and from there into growth. I love the simplicity of that. And I think it's really useful to remember that even the most resilient people can find themselves in that fear place at times, and that these traits and behaviours, so the things that you called out, and also the things that I shared around what helps us access resilience, you know, they're all things that that we can use to kind of keep bringing ourselves out of the fear into learning and then into growth. It's like, it's not a, you know, it's not just like, oh, suddenly I'm super resilient and never more shall I be afraid again. You know, we're all human, and we all find ourselves there sometimes. I think there's something else here as well that for me kind of sums up a lot of this work, which is that by consciously and compassionately, is that word again, using those tools, we develop these neural pathways. You know, we've touched on quite a few sort of bits of kind of science and positive psychology as we've talked today, and so what we're doing is we're developing these new neural pathways so that each time we access these tools, we build that kind of resilience muscle that enables us to access them more easily the next time that they're needed. And so it goes, and so it goes, and it becomes this beautiful virtuous circle of supporting ourselves. And really that relates back to something I said right at the start, which is that, you know, this isn't a sprint, this is a marathon, and we lay this stuff down to benefit our future selves. So yeah, so they're my kind of final thoughts. Anything else from you, Kerry, before we sign off?
Sure, we've got, just before I respond, Henny, I'm just going to mention a couple of things that have popped up in the chat box. Da-di-da-di-da. Yeah, the final thoughts really was, look, the whole sort of psychology of change is incredibly well researched, and it's a process, and you know the highs and lows of change and how we access resilience and build it is a very normal process, and sometimes it can feel like we're taking 2 steps forward and 2 steps back. And you know, for me, I think this whole process operates on lots of different levels in different dimensions. You know, you might be coping well with certain change at work and being quite resilient, and then less so some things not going so well at home. So it's recognizing that there's a lot going on, but using these tools that we've shared with you today can be incredibly useful. And as Henny just said, we're laying down these new neuro pathways, but also, what's also key is being compassionate, and we're all human beings. So with that in mind, I would just like to thank you very much for joining us today. If you want to develop your leadership competencies further, you can either work with us as coaches, either on a one-to-one basis, or join our small group coaching sessions. And we've got a series of these coming up, as you can see on the screen. And they're specifically open to current and emerging females in our industry. We talked earlier about leveraging strengths as leaders, and in our first group coaching session on the 4th of June, we're going to use a very powerful and analytical tool that specifically identifies your individual work strengths, and we'll coach you through how to leverage these individual strengths in your role during COVID-19. There are limited places on these small group sessions, but if you are interested in us running these privately within your organisation, then do get in touch, because this is something that we could do too. And if you think it'd be useful for you and your team, then just reach out. As we mentioned earlier, we'll share all the slides and the recording from today, and we will also include some specific resources we've referenced today and some inspiring TED Talks from other great female leaders. So on that point, it's been wonderful to spend an hour in your company today. Hopefully what we've shared has resonated with you in some way, and we look forward to working with you again in the future. Okay, bye from me. Bye-bye.
Bye. Take care.